This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your host, Radio Joe Hughes, and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day wherever you're listening from, and welcome. It's episode 474 of IAQ Radio. It's Friday, August 25th, 2017. And this week we look forward to talking to Dr. Pawel Wargocki for the hour. He's calling in from the Technical University of Denmark. We're going to talk about CO2 and whether it's a pollutant or merely an index for indoor air quality. Looking forward to a great show with Dr. Wargocki. Before we get started, let's thank our marquee sponsors.
IAQ Radio marquee sponsors are John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Healthy Indoor Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Particles Plus, engineers and manufacturers, feature rich particle counters, air quality monitoring, instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. ParticlesPlus.com. Count on us.
Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their services or products. And last but not least, please visit the IAQ Training Institute website for the most current dates for the training you trust at IAQtraining.com. All right, let's turn it over to the Z-Man for today's IAQ Radio trivia question.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com, or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man with this week's IAQ Radio trivia question.
Hello, everybody. Congratulations to John Lapotaire of Florida IAQ Solutions, Winter Springs, Florida, who answered the prior trivia question, correctly identifying Robert Koch as the father of modern bacteriology and winner of a Nobel Prize. The IAQ Radio trivia question for today, Friday, August 25th, 2017, has been sponsored by Ideas, the solution chemistry company, creating unique solutions to odor removal, surface cleaning, and decontamination problems. Here is today's two-part trivia question. Name the first gas to be distinguished from ordinary air and the scientist who discovered it. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, today's guest is Dr. Pawel Wargocki. He's an associate professor at the Technical University of Denmark, past president of the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, past chair of the ASHRAE Environmental Health Committee, vice president of Indoor Air 2008, and a list, if I went over here, of papers and positions that would take for the rest of the hour. So what we're going to do is just jump over and see. Do we have you on the line, Pawel?
Oh, you can hear me now. Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I'm online. Hello, Joe. Hello to all the listeners.
Great to have you. Sorry
from
about
the distant Denmark.
Yeah, this is great. We've had people from, Germany, Denmark, Portugal, Great Britain, Australia. So it's an international crowd, and it's great to have you on. You know, I saw you speak at the IAQA Conference in, I guess that was like March of this year, and I was fascinated by the presentation you did. A lot of it was focused on CO2, carbon dioxide. There's been a lot of recent interest in carbon dioxide. We made the title of the show, Is CO2 a Pollutant or Merely an Index for IAQ? But before we get into that, let's get into a little of your background. How did you first start getting interested in indoor air quality issues?
Thank you, Joe. And thank you for the kind words. You know, it's always to be an honor, to be a plenary speaker, but, it's a little bit of stress usually, to come up with a good topic and then present it, not only just fully present it, but also present it in a way that the audience will not fall asleep. So hopefully our listeners will not fall asleep today when I speak. So coming back to your first question is, actually, it happened nearly after I graduated as a student from the university. So my background is that I was educated in Poland, and towards the end of my studies, just before the graduation, I went to Denmark for a short visit. It was a visit of a few months, and this is where I met Professor Fanger, who probably some of the listeners would know him from the PMV PPD model for the thermal comfort, but he was also known for many other, inventions for the IAQ. Among others, he was one of the founders of the current, ventilation rates that are in 62.1, ASHRAE 62.1. But nevertheless, during the course of the studies in Poland, the Warsaw University of Technology, I was more interested in the heating, radiators, and all that stuff. And when I went to Denmark, I got sort of fascinated by the research that was done by the institute there. Basically, I was doing a small project on the use of fragrances to mask the pollutants. So basically, you may think of, using a different odorants, that could, fragrances that could mask some noxious or smelly pollutants, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this actually got me interested in IAQ. I went back to Poland after a short stay, and then returned in '93 for another short stay, which actually is still going on, because I have never returned to Poland after my coming in '93. And then I was involved in many different projects related to IAQ.
So you started out...
So basically, very, very briefly, it's because, the group and the people and, the first fascination for the research that has been done, facilities available here, and very nice, atmosphere and a sort of engagement in the topic.
Well, tell us a little more about the Technical University of Denmark. What are the, primary interests or studies? What type of degrees do they specialize in?
Yeah. So Technical University of Denmark is one of the largest technical universities in Scandinavia, if not the largest. I'll try to, I prepared for the interview, so I can tell you, we are like more than 10,000 students, and we have like 1,500, nearly 1,200 PhD students, about 5,000 staff. And then we have, let me see here, we have 19 departments, 5 centers, and 5 affiliated companies. So we are pretty large. Mm. So this is a technical university, so the science that we, or maybe education that we promote here is actually the technically related. So, everything that is related, to the mechanical engineering, to chemistry, but we have also the space department, which is related to, studying the space issues, and then also nanotechnology department, chemistry department, and so on. So all those sciences that that are taught at the Technical University. Probably we are very much known for, of course, our group outside in the world, but also other groups are famous for doing some work on energy and some work on the biotechnology and so on.
I see. And you started out studying fragrances, I guess, and how to cover up IAQ related odors. What other areas of indoor air quality have you focused on over the years?
Over the years, I actually started with fragrances, and then my first real task was to develop the reference exposure for pollutants. So I was trying to simulate or try to create the artificial indoor air, in a sense. So I was trying to combine different pollutants together that are found indoors to basically replicate and create a sort of a reference exposure, reference gas for indoor air. And that was one of the topics of my PhD. My actually PhD was 3 parts, so I was looking at this aspect. This was one of them, and I was looking at different mixtures. One of the mixture had 22 components, and the others were less components, actually. But we figured out that it's very, very difficult to do that. The reason is basically, you have different mixtures of pollutants indoors, and not only, even if we identify major pollutants, they can be in different, concentrations, depending on different environment, and then, those different combinations may elicit different responses from people. So it was a sort of, I would say, very difficult task, or maybe impossible to realize, but nevertheless, we learned a lot about that. Okay. Then another task was to look on how to combine ventilation requirements for different types of pollutants indoors. We have different sources of pollutants indoors, and we have sources, from people, of human bioeffluents. We have building materials. At that time, we had also tobacco smoking and so on. And the question was, if we define the ventilation for each group of pollutants, what we should do with the ventilation requirements. Should we add those ventilation requirements, or we should ventilate for the most, smelly or most, or the pollutants that has the highest concentration, or the strongest source, and so on and so on. And then, towards the end of my work, I got a task to look at the effects of pollutants on human cognitive performance, basically on whether the indoor air pollution can have measurable effect on how we perform at work. And that's probably my biggest interest, and has been a biggest interest in the last 15 or 20 years, and probably my name is mostly recognized for this type of research if you look through the literature and if you talk with people. But I have also other interests, and my major probably interest is related to air quality and understanding the effects of exposures on humans, and how we can mitigate those negative effects that those exposures can produce.
That kind of nicely rolls into the topic for today, which is some recent studies we've been seeing on CO2 and how it affects health and performance. And you gave a nice introduction to the history of CO2 during your presentation. Can you just kind of walk listeners through some of the early research on CO2, who did it, why they did it, and what up until fairly recently was, the common, I guess, what people thought about CO2 until, we've seen some changes here recently.
So, yes, first, I think we should make sure that our listeners understand that we are talking about the CO2 indoors, not outdoors, because, when we talk about a climate change, very often we talk about a CO2 emission, right? And then that is causing a climate change. So we are not talking about this CO2, we are talking about a CO2 that is indoors and is primarily generated by us. It's a metabolite, human metabolite. And of course, there are certain situations that CO2 is generated through the process. For example, in the beer production, or maybe some other. But basically, what we are talking about is the CO2 that is produced by humans. So, well, the the CO2 was discussed already in the 18th century, and actually it was Lavoisier who was the father of gaseous chemistry, and he actually recognized the CO2 and the oxygen and attributed all negative effects to the presence of carbon dioxide, basically. Before Lavoisier, it was Mayo who actually observed, or maybe attributed the negative effects that he was seeing with animals to so-called igneo-aerial particles, which were actually a carbon dioxide. So this was the first, research on CO2 probably that was performed. And at that time, in the 18th century and later on, CO2 was considered to be a pollutant, basically causing the negative effect on humans. So all the negative effects that have been seen in relation to the exposure were attributed to CO2. But then later in the 19th century, Pettenkofer, the German hygienist from Munich, a very well-known hygienist, and actually, to be honest, his books or whatever reports that he produced at that time are still valid, actually. So he performed the research which showed that it is not the CO2 that is responsible for the effects that we see. He said that the corruption of the air is not caused solely by the carbon dioxide content. It's actually caused by the emissions from humans, which he called, human body odor or human bioeffluents. He considered the CO2 as an excellent marker of the pollutants that are emitted by humans in the situation when all the other pollutants are removed or avoided indoors. And then, so then after that, the CO2 became a sort of an indicator of indoor air quality. And Pettenkofer suggested the level of CO2 of 1,000 ppm to be a level above which we can expect the negative or the unacceptable air quality or perception with the air quality, and then the CO2 began to be used as the indicator of the unacceptable indoor air quality, a marker of indoor air quality, and it is used until today, like this. Of course, there has been also a lot of research on CO2 at for the toxic reasons. So I don't want to go into detail, but there have been a lot of studies looking at what levels the CO2 is toxic for humans. And if we look through this research, we see that these are levels which are far above the exposure levels that we see indoors. And if you look at the occupational guidelines, we see the recommended the guideline value at 5,000 ppm, which is seldom measured indoors. And this is an exposure that can last for 8 hours during the working day to carbon dioxide, and it's not considered to produce any toxic effects on humans or harmful effects on humans. And 30,000 is a stall value, so it's very, very high levels. Hardly ever, never probably. 30,000 is never experienced in those probably, unless you have a source of carbon dioxide. So CO2 in the beginning, in the early years, was considered to be a pollutant, and then since Pettenkofer, since 19th century, it has been considered merely as a marker of indoor air quality. Sometimes, erroneously used because it's basically only can be considered as the marker of indoor air quality if we have humans indoors. Without humans, I mean, there is no source of carbon dioxide, so, the levels of carbon dioxide can be as low as the outdoor level, which does not mean that the exposure levels or the pollutant levels are at low concentrations, which do not cause negative effects or harmful effects on humans.
I'm curious.
Okay.
With respect to the military and the U.S. military, early on we put people in submarines, and they were obviously creating, high levels of CO2. Was there much research? I'm sure they did research on it, but can you comment on what they found?
I was not able to find any. I know that there has been some research that showed that the bones of these marines that were staying long in the submarines were softer, and but I was not able, or sorry for if I missed some studies, but I was not able to see any studies that show negative effects of the exposures in the submarines. In a snorkel submarine, we would expect the levels of less than 3,000 ppm, and in the nuclear submarine, we would expect the levels of about what is it? In the snorkel submarines, about below 30,000 ppm, and then in the nuclear submarines below 10,000 ppm, maybe 7,000 ppm. So higher than what is recommended for the occupational limits.
You would think that these are people with nuclear weapons, and they've got lives in their hands. I mean, you would think if there was good research to indicate their performance was jeopardized by high levels of CO2, the military would be pretty concerned about that. But I've like you, I've never seen much research that or even any reference to research that talks about that.
Yeah, we will be talking in a moment about the studies which show, the effects of carbon dioxide at much lower levels than occur in submarines, and actually levels that cause effects on decision making. So basically, in a battle situation in a submarine, you have to take decisions, right? And high level of CO2 would probably reduce your ability to take the right decisions, right? So, it is probably a different situation, and also, it has always. I was always wondering why we do not see any effects in the submarine. But remember that people, the Marines, are specially selected, and especially officers, the ones which are in charge of the submarine. These are people after very long training, so they are able to control, somehow maybe everything, maybe including a little bit of their physiology and how they feel, and so they can maybe overrule if there is a negative effect, they may overrule it or combat it in this very stressful situation, which is a battle. So the fact that we do not see those effects there in submarine does not rule out the possibility that the effect can occur, but they basically are able to, combat it.
Yeah, through either processes or training or having people that are,
Exactly. So they are specially selected people for this type of job.
I see. Well, let's go to, there was 2012 paper, Is CO2 an Indoor Pollutant? Direct Effects of Low to Moderate CO2 Concentrations on Human Decision-Making and Performance. And this was a paper that, well, why don't you tell listeners a little bit about that paper? A couple of the authors have been on the show. We had Mark Mendel, Bill Fisk. Satish, I'm not familiar with, but maybe you could tell people a little bit more about that paper.
These are very recognized scientists. Bill Fisk and Mark Mendel. These are the persons. When you look through the literature on IAQ, you will find their names on the very significant publications. So I know the full story, and probably Bill Fisk told you the story earlier on the show. If not, maybe I can tell a story. So Bill got fascinated by the two things. He got fascinated by the measuring a battery for performance that was introduced by Usha Satish. And Bill Fisk has been looking at the literature on the effects of indoor environmental quality on performance, and most of this literature is basically using a simple cognitive task to measure performance of people. So he was looking for more sophisticated way of measuring performance, and he got fascinated by the battery that was presented by Usha. At the same time, he found two papers that were published in Hungarian scientific journal, in English actually, which reported effects of carbon dioxide on human performance. So at the levels of about 4,000 ppm. So those studies are not very systematic, but nevertheless, somehow Bill got interested in the topic. So what they did is, receiving a large funding from the California EPA, I believe, or DOE, I'm not sure. They decided to run a small experiment in which they would look at the effect of pure carbon dioxide on the cognitive performance measured with the Satish battery. And the Satish battery is the sort of a unique method of measuring performance because it looks at the it measures the how capable we are or how able we are to take decision under stressful situation. So we basically challenged with some situations. Say we can be in charge of the of evacuating people from the town, or maybe evacuating people from the building, and so on, and then we have to take decisions, and those decisions are then somehow measured by the software and then transferred into the measurable, some numbers that mean something, in terms of the cognitive performance. So what they did is they had 22 subjects, and then they exposed them to the two levels of elevated levels of carbon dioxide. So they had a reference condition in which the level of carbon dioxide was more or less similar to the outdoor level, slightly above that. It was about 600 ppm. And then they had two elevated levels, 1,000 ppm and 2,500 ppm. So in each of these conditions, they had a very, very high ventilation rate in the exposure chamber, so that any type of pollutants that would be produced by the people present or the subjects that were exposed, or any type of a material that is inside the chamber, would be diluted to the insignificant levels. And they actually confirmed that with the chemical measurements that they had a very, very low background levels of pollutants. So the dominant pollutant in those exposure studies was carbon dioxide. So again, they exposed it to 1,000 and 2,500 ppm. And what they saw is a systematic reduction in the performance on the ability to take decisions by the subjects. And it was across, they defined 9 different measures of the defining the decision-making process from measures that reflect a low cognitive demand to the measures that require high cognitive demand. And except perhaps one or two measures, for all of them, they have seen systematic aggravation of disability. And they saw it at 1,000 ppm, and but it was not statistically significant. And then when at 2,500 ppm, they actually saw it statistically significant effect, which means that they cannot exclude it, that this is a random effect. And but if you look at the data, it's basically a very systematic. So there is an effect at 1,000 ppm and then 2,000 ppm. So this is it was really a sort of an eye opener and sort of like, strike of a thunder, or whatever. For many researchers, is, oh, come on, maybe when we consider the carbon dioxide as the indicator of the air quality, but maybe CO2 is actually a pollutant itself, and it may be causing some negative effects on performance. For that particular, battery of tests that were presented for the subjects. And I must say, when I read the paper for the first time, I was struck by, by how well the study was designed. There's basically, you cannot, object anything in the design, and you cannot object anything in the results. It's very, very clear and straightforward effects. So this is why it probably was got so much attraction, by in the field.
And I think it led to other studies as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to break for halftime now and stop and thank our sponsors. And then when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the paper that came out of Harvard, and then two papers that your group put out not long ago in 2016, I believe. So we'll be back with the second half of our interview with Dr. Pawel Wargocki in about 90 seconds.
IAQ Radio would like to thank our association sponsors. The Indoor Air Quality Association, a nonprofit multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Visit them at IAQA.org. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them, wolfsense.com. IAQ marquee sponsors are John Donn Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at johndonn.com. That's JONDON.com. Healthy Indoor Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Particles Plus, engineers and manufacturers, feature rich particle counters, air quality monitoring, instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. ParticlesPlus.com. Count on us.
Okay, we're back for the second half of our interview. We've got Dr. Pawel Wargocki on the line. I've got a quick just clarification on the first study we just discussed, Satish, Mendel et al. They did not, if I recall correctly, did not look at health outcomes, just performance. Is that correct?
Well, they are not reporting health outcomes, yes.
Okay.
In the paper.
All right.
So we don't know what was the... Well, actually, we don't know anything about that. So they only look at the performance outcomes, yes, report them in the paper.
So the next paper we wanted to talk about is in 2015, Associations of Cognitive Function Scores with Carbon Dioxide, Ventilation, and Volatile Organic Compound Exposures in Office Workers, a controlled exposure study of green and conventional office environments. This was Joe Allen, Pierce McNaughton, Usha Satish again, and a couple others, including John Spengler. Can you talk to listeners about that particular study, give them a little overview, just like you did with the first one, and talk a little bit about the results?
Well, yes. It's just to your comment, it will be very nice to see whether there have been any effects on the health outcomes, of course, because it would let us with some explanations of the effects that we see. Unfortunately, we could not see that. As for the second study, so it is a sort of a replication of the study of Satish, Mendel, and Fisk. And not only replication, but it's also an extension to their study. So they included not only they looked at not only the effects of carbon dioxide, but also looked at the effects of other pollutants on the cognitive performance. And the cognitive performance measured using the same battery of tests. So again, we are talking about the decision-making performance, or the ability to take decisions, as measured with the battery that was used in other, medical research from which, ASHRAE is coming. ASHRAE Satish is coming. So what they did is they had I saw the facilities actually. I didn't have a chance to see the facilities of the first study, but I saw the facilities, and they are existing actually still in Syracuse Center of Excellence in their building. The facilities of the second study. So they have an office like the chamber. So basically, what they have is a room with cubicles. And they can actually put people in there, and they can perform work like in the ordinary office, space. And each of the cubicle is ventilated by the local ventilation. It's the underfloor ventilation. So basically, you can easily control the conditions in each cubicle. It's very important, maybe, information, because if you think about cubicles, you always think about the air distribution and how the air is provided, and whether everyone is receiving the same exposure, or the same air basically, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. In their study, actually each person received a similar exposure, because they received the same air from the underfloor outlet, and so what they did is they had this 24 people, and then they invited them to participate in the experiment, which lasted 6 days, and they basically they performed their work, normal work, and in this facility for 8 hours in 6 days experiments, and then each day they were exposed to different conditions, and 2 of them were 2 different levels of carbon dioxide. And then towards the end of the day, so they were working there for 8 hours with 1 hour break for lunch. Towards the end of the working day, they were again presented the battery of tests, and they performed this battery of tests as in the first study. And also, the design here was a beautiful design of the Harvard group. It's really, it should be, presented to many people who plan to do the similar research. What they did also is that the first exposure that the subject or the people that were recruited for the study they experienced was repeated also towards the end as the last exposure, just to see whether the responses are the same or not. So what they found is similar effects as the Satish Mendel-Fisk effect. Here they have, the 8 hour exposure, so this is an extension to that. And at the levels, if I remember well, below 1,000 ppm, so at even lower, slightly lower levels of carbon dioxide that have been seen in the first paper. So it is basically a replication of the first study, extension, to the longer, exposure, and again, different group of people, different experimental team, and again, slightly lower levels of carbon dioxide. The only thing that is probably not which we have to look at is that they use exactly the same battery of tests. So they did not, use another type of task or another way of measuring performance. So they basically use the same battery as in the first study. So basically, this study confirmed the first. So now we have two experiments that have the same result, showing that carbon dioxide should be considered as a pollutant, especially as regards the cognitive performance.
Okay, interesting. Now, let's move forward to 2016 and the papers that your group put together here. We've got Zhang, Wargocki, and Thurigod. I hope I pronounced that properly. And Leon.
Yes.
And is that?
Yes, thank you.
If you mention that, who is that group?
Okay, so I was very much interested in the first study of Fisk, Mendel, and Satish, and I promised myself and also promised Bill Fisk that we would like to repeat the experiment that they performed, and they applauded to it because it's a good idea always to repeat the study. So for years I've been trying to find some funding for that. It's not easy to find funding for this type of work unless you have generous sponsors, and Bill and their group in California, they had a very, very generous funding, and then also the Harvard group got a very, very generous funding. So they were lucky, and I was trying to look some for grant, and it was very difficult for me until the moment that I applied for the local funding in Denmark. Here in the university, we can apply for small funding that is basically from the small grants from the foundation that was set up by one of the employees of our institute. So he was a book collector, and after he died, actually, some of the money that he collected over the years in books, were converted into the foundation, and then now there are grants given for I believe, Alzheimer's disease. This is the disease that he died of, and also for the research for the researchers or the employees of my institute. I'm at the Department of Civil Engineering. So this is I was able to get some money for it, and then I had collaboration with the Jiao Tong University and group there in China, in Shanghai, and I was able to attract a Ph.D. student. This is the main author of those papers, to come to Denmark and perform the work. So it's coincidence, all the lucky coincidence. She was able to get the Ph.D. scholarship from China, so she came to our group and performed the work in our chambers. And I was able to pay for the expenses that were in relation to the experiments. The other two authors, Thurigod, she's a biostatistician who helped us in the analysis, and Lian is the professor at Jiao Tong University.
I see.
The professor of Xiaojing Zhang, the main author. So this is a little bit of history for that. So I got the money, and we decided to replicate the study of Fisk, Mendel, and Satish in our chambers. We have facilities. We have actually 12 environmental chambers, and we have very unique facilities. Some of our facilities, are stainless steel chambers, which has very, very low levels of pollutants inside, and we decided to make an experiment in such chamber, although we would prefer to make it in the ordinary office to just reduce the levels of pollutants. And we also wanted to use the same battery of tests as in the study of Harvard study and the Fisk study or Satish study. But the cost, it was too high for us for using this battery, so we decided to use our own battery of performance tests. So what we did is basically we exposed human subjects to elevated level of carbon dioxide. Again, we used 1,000 ppm, and then we went up above the level that was studied by Fisk and Mendel and Satish to 3,000 ppm. Then we thought maybe we should also look on whether, the carbon dioxide is produced by humans. Very seldom is, it's never appearing itself without any presence of any other pollutants. So then we were thinking, what if we just also exposed our subjects to human bioeffluents, including the carbon dioxide that is produced by people, to the same levels, and just to see whether we would see stronger effects because there are other pollutants, or maybe the similar effects as we would expect to see, with carbon dioxide. So our experimental matrix looked like this. We had a reference condition, low level of carbon dioxide, high ventilation rate, and then to this we added carbon dioxide to elevated carbon dioxide. It was just artificial carbon dioxide from the cylinder, like in the other studies, to elevate it to 1,000 and 3,000 ppm. And then what we did is we supplemented those two with the elevated levels of carbon dioxide, but with human bioeffluents. So we basically reduced the ventilation rate in the chamber to elevate the levels of the carbon dioxide and bioeffluents in the chamber produced by the subjects sitting in the chamber to exactly the same levels of 1,000 and 3,000 ppm. So now we have a matrix. We have a pure CO2 and CO2 together with bioeffluents. And we have similar exposure lengths, actually maybe a little bit longer than in the first study, and then different types of cognitive tasks that people perform. We have the psychological tests, the tests that are normally used by psychologists to test, different skills, cognitive skills like, memory, like concentration, like reaction time. And then we have tasks that we usually perform, or used to perform at least, in our at our work. At least two of them are proofreading and proofreading of the text, maybe, and text typing. We still type, and we still, from time to time, proofread the text that we type. But on top of it, we had some arithmetical calculations. So we are not able to do the similar expose subjects to or present the same cognitive tasks as in other studies. And then we supplemented the measurements with, subjectively assessed, health symptoms, acute health symptoms. So we were asking subjects at any of the conditions whether they experienced any symptoms, such as whether they had problems with concentration, or maybe they had some irritation, and so on. And also, we measured their physiological responses. Simple measurements, of blood pressure, heart rate and skin temperature, and also we measured the biomarkers in saliva, amylase and cortisol, just to get a little bit of more information than the other studies, and maybe try to figure out, are there any, mechanisms behind why is it that we see the effects of carbon dioxide? Trying to understand what is going on, right? Because as you said, why is it that carbon dioxide is causing those dramatic effects on cognitive performance? So results, right?
Yes. And what did you find?
Yes, maybe some questions if you have, but I can go to the results immediately.
Let's do that.
Let's do that. Okay, so to our surprise, we haven't seen effects of carbon dioxide similar to what has been seen in the other two studies. So neither at 1,000 ppm or 3,000 ppm we saw any effects of carbon dioxide on a cognitive performance of the type of tests and tasks that were performed by the subjects. These were different than in the other two studies, that we have to emphasize it several times. And we haven't seen any indication either in the subjective responses of subjects or subjective ratings that there were any negative effects of the exposure of carbon dioxide. So basically, reported intensity of acute health symptoms was unchanged by the elevated levels of carbon dioxide. Air quality was unchanged. And carbon dioxide is odorless, so we would not even expect that there would be any effect on the perceived air quality. But when they were exposed to human bioeffluents with carbon dioxide, what we saw was that they responded to this exposure already at 1,000 and maybe even more at 3,000 ppm. And the response was with the aggravated air quality as perceived by them, and then also they reported increased intensity of symptoms related to the we call them general symptoms, so neurobehavioral symptoms such as difficulty to concentrate or fatigue and so on. And also few, not all, but few of the performance tests, or the performance on few of the tasks that they performed was also affected by the elevated levels of human bioeffluents together with carbon dioxide. But this has not been seen for the pure carbon dioxide.
So
there have been also some physiological responses, but I don't want to go into details. The most important was that we were not able to see the similar effects of carbon dioxide as in the other two studies, but we saw the effects when carbon dioxide was present together with human bioeffluents. And those effects probably could be attributed to the other pollutants emitted by humans rather than the carbon dioxide. The role of carbon dioxide is difficult to explain, and we cannot explain that. Yes, Joe, you have a question.
Well, I was just wondering what kind of feedback have you gotten since publishing, your papers? I would imagine there's a lot of questions. What kind of questions are you getting from other researchers?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who, we have a lot of questions here, and the question is why we do not see the results. Why we do not see effects of carbon dioxide? Why we cannot repeat the similar effects as the other two groups? How is this? Are the results? Should there be? Are there very strong results? I mean, are the weak? What is the weakness of those results? What are the limitations of the results? So in response to the latter, what we did is we exposed people to the level of 5,000 ppm. We elevated carbon dioxide, so we have supplementary study on a smaller group of subjects where we increase the level of carbon dioxide, and again we could not see any effects on the same battery of tests. And the questions were also whether the difference that we see is not maybe related to the method of testing, of the cognitive performance. And actually, probably this is where it is all about. I mean, probably the method that we used for testing of cognitive performance in our study and in the other studies leads to the difference between the two experiments, I would say.
I guess that makes sense because a lot of the earlier, none of the earlier studies before 2012 would have used what I think you referred to as the Satish battery of, testing on trying to determine performance.
they were used in the medical research and for the people with, people who are drug addicts or maybe who overuse alcohol and so on. And this battery was seen to be sensitive to that. This battery was not used in the context of indoor air and indoor air quality. So very, weak exposures or very weak stressors actually compared to the other very, very significant, stressors such as, drug addiction, or maybe something like that. So the only work that has been used with Satish was in relation to, I think, the painters who are exposed to the paint during painting. And then they have seen, so you can think about, freshly remodeled or freshly painted house, in which, people are exposed, or maybe office workers move into the freshly renovated office, and then, they probably have a high exposure to the pollutants emitted from the paints that are used and so on. And then they were able to show the negative effects of those exposures on the battery of tests that they presented. But other than that, no, none of us were aware actually of this battery, and we were not using it. So this is a sort of a weakness of their approach, because the battery has a very little connection to the real life. We really don't know whether the effects that are seen on the battery, how they translate to the actual normal work performance, I would say. So, what we see there, how it translates, is it the same magnitude or is it a less magnitude, and how well they can represent or simulate a normal office work. The same actually argument or the same criticism can be put to basically also our battery of tests. Nevertheless, we usually try to expose people or have people or subject people to the tests that they are familiar with. Is something that they would normally do and normally practice. So
we're running a little over. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Let me give you a quick.
So basically, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm talking too much. Sorry.
No, that's
Please.
fine. All right, let me do a quick. If you've got another 5 minutes, we got a little late start.
Sure, I have plenty of time. No problem.
All right.
No.
There's a couple of questions I pulled off of your presentation from IAQA. They have nice, short answers to them, and I think we can go through about 5 questions real quick that'll kind of help summarize this. First, does archival literature indicate that CO2 is toxic?
Yes, it does. So CO2 is toxic.
And it's
toxic at the levels that are one order of magnitude higher than typically occurring indoors.
Okay.
So basically, at the levels that are indoors, you could hardly expect, the same toxic effects from CO2.
Okay. And does CO2 create risks for building occupants?
So our answer to that is no, but there is a caveat to that. There is one thing, is that unless they perform very demanding cognitive tasks. So it's because of the work of the 2 groups in California and in Harvard, which shows that at the very highly demanding tasks, when we are talking about taking decisions and highly cognitive demanding performance, at these levels, when you perform this type of work, perhaps carbon dioxide can have a negative effect.
Should ventilation standards be changed based on recent studies on the effects of CO2?
No, why they should be? Basically, they do show that CO2 is an excellent proxy for the potential negative effects, and then there is no reason to change the ventilation requirements. The ventilation requirements, if properly, of course, implemented indoors, they would keep the CO2 level at maybe 1,000 ppm and even less than this. These are the levels that are seen in the offices. less than 1,800 ppm, at
Okay.
which probably the levels that the negative effects of CO2 would not be seen unless we perform the demanding task. Yes.
What about human bioaffluence? It seems like that's one area where we could do a little more study, separating out the effects of CO2 versus bioaffluence. Is there any other way besides ventilation to lower exposures to bioaffluence?
Today, probably not. But we need to use our brain and develop the innovative solutions of some sort of a local control of the human bioaffluence. You could think about, there are studies now that I know of looking at the ventilated chairs, for example, being, and we know that there are ventilated chairs in cars which remove bioaffluence basically at the spot, at the source.
I see.
So, no, today, basically general ventilation. So what is the issue about the bioaffluence like this? If we reduce exposure to any other pollutants, then the bioaffluence become dominant pollutant. And this is why we should start looking back into the effects of bioaffluence, because there is a trend, at least in Europe, to reduce pollutant emissions from other sources of pollution. And now we don't have tobacco smoking, right? And then building materials which are less emitting, and these are organic, and then green materials, emitting less. And then suddenly the human becomes really a dominant source. And we have very little information on whether this is an issue. I mean, will bioaffluence produce negative effects on us? And that we have very little information about.
And let me turn it over to my co-host, Cliff Zlotnick. I know you've got a question.
No, I said I had none.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I didn't read that properly. All right, before we go, I've got two more questions. One is, so we titled this show, Is CO2 a Pollutant or Merely an Index for Indoor Air Quality? And that was the title of your presentation at the IAQA Conference. So what's the answer?
I would lean towards the latter part of that. It's merely an index of IAQ, for IAQ.
Okay. It can
the
be
issue about the carbon dioxide. Yeah. So I don't think it is a pollutant. And even if it is, I think we should think about all the other pollutants as well. So I think it should not, sort of make us blind to all the other pollutants that are present in those. And only talking about carbon dioxide as a pollutant would basically mean that we can ignore all the other, we can forget about all the other pollutants that are indoors that we also need to deal with. But I do not see any toxicological evidence that at the levels indoors CO2 is a pollutant. So it is an excellent index for indoor air quality when people are indoors.
Okay. Have you? We had a show not long ago with Dr. Nuno Cahan from Portugal, and he had looked at some CO2 levels while people were sleeping. And I know that here in the States, a lot of people button up their bedroom, and especially in the winter when we're trying not to use a lot of a lot of energy. Are you aware of any good research that shows that maybe high levels of CO2 affect sleep patterns?
We have only one study that actually was produced. I'm one of the authors of that, which looked at the negative effects of poor air quality, meaning elevated levels of human bioaffluence, or poor ventilation, basically, on sleep quality. And we do show that the poor air quality or reduced ventilation can have negative effects on our sleep quality, and it even can affect our next day performance. We don't have evidence or information. I'm not aware of the effects of pure carbon dioxide or just carbon dioxide on the sleep quality. But, Joe, we can meet probably in a year from today, and I will have this information because we are just about to start experiments together with Aarhus University, who is the principal investor. Aarhus is another town in Denmark at the university, which we start an experiment in which we would expose children at the school age, age probably 8 to 10, will be sleeping in an environment in which there will be elevated carbon dioxide and elevated bioeffluent. And we want to see whether sleeping in such environments have negative effects on their quality of sleep and the next day performance. It's very important. They go to school next day. They need to be ready for schooling. And then if it does affect, it may have significant implications on how we ventilate our bedrooms.
Well,
This is really unresearched territory. The sleep. We spend 1/3 of our life sleeping, and we know very little how the indoor environment affects our sleep quality.
I look forward to having you back.
One of the topics for the future.
Yes, I'd love to do that. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything we missed? Anything at all?
Not really. I mean, we have to remember that carbon dioxide outdoors is increasing and increasing very, very much. Over the last 10, 20 years, it increased by about 60 ppm. So it's actually important. So the numbers that are used for CO2 as the indicator of the IAQ should be somehow controlled or adjusted for that increase in carbon dioxide outdoors. Other than that, I hope that I didn't want to take a position on and say, which of the studies are good or bad. I think all of the work that is presented is very, very consistent, very nice, and very, very good research. And we still have this debate. I mean, the still debate is why is it that the effects are seen in some of the studies of CO2 in some of the studies, and in other studies they are not seen. So that is a question, that probably we will have more answers to that when we meet next time.
And if we didn't have different study results, then it wouldn't be as much fun.
That's correct. Yes, exactly.
It's great to have you as a guest. Dr. Pawel Wargocki, calling from the Technical University of Denmark. Thank you very much. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe.
All right, you're welcome. This is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks again to this week's guest, Dr. Pawel Wargocki out of the University of Denmark, the Technical University of Denmark. We were talking a lot about CO2, bioeffluent, and indoor air quality. Great stuff. We'll be taking a little break next Friday for the holiday weekend, but we're going to play a really good flashback show. I also want to thank my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, at the controls. John, you got to have faith. Most importantly, our growing group of loyal listeners will be back live in 2 weeks. We'll still do a flashback show next week with the next episodes of IAQ Radio.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.